instrument, whether it be drums, bass, sax, horns, whatever you want to call it. And like in the case of what we're doing, I guess in 2012, like obviously there's people behind NPCs and computers just basically making music, right?
And by
but there's still instruments.
Sampling devices that are used.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's still instruments, whether you're talking about the actual NPC being used as an instrument or the instruments that they're sampling. And the person themselves is the actual instrument. You know, it doesn't matter what they use.
So you would accept these borders between instruments?
There really isn't. Like you mentioned before, like jazz and hip hop are pretty much the same thing. You could point out the differences, sure, but it's all an extension of the same culture. You know, and so I mean, I'm a jazz musician. For those of you who might confuse me with the hat, like, I feel comfortable to say that, you know. But it truly is the same thing, and you know, if Quincy Jones said that, you know. So
what attracted you to doing this kind of work?
What attracted me?
Yeah, what attracted you to doing particularly what you're doing? With
I kind of feel like I've been doing it my whole life. I don't know. I was born in the '80s, so it's not like I was, you know, I was born into hip hop. It was already there for me. So I'm a part of a generation of live musicians that for one, we're trying to let you know that there are live people that make music, but also the point of that it doesn't have to be stiff. It doesn't have to be on the marching band field. It doesn't have to be just in the jazz band room. There's nothing wrong with jazz. And it doesn't have to be in the classical room either. You know, like I tour around and stuff, and I play trumpet. Like sometimes I'll be in a suit, and then we have to do like a little wardrobe change, and I'm in my regular street clothes, t-shirt or whatever. And literally, the same kids that saw me in the first in the suit see me in the regular clothes, and they're like, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" And they're like crowded around me. But that's part of like the generation I am. Like hip hop is a very integral part of that. Like people don't even realize is like you don't have to necessarily be just stuck in the 50s with all that type of stuff.
A lot of those are just kind of habits that you have repeated.
Yeah, and we've been doing shows like this for a while, and people always have the same questions. But honestly, the best way is just to see it, because it truly is the same thing. But it's like in 2012, we're so far removed from where it even began, people don't even have an exact definition of what we're talking about.
Well, it's funny you mentioned seeing it, because you guys are playing tomorrow night.
Friday tomorrow.
Friday tomorrow. Yeah. At 7:30 as well. So again, all the information is on the back of this gorgeous, free postcard. Now we want to hear from you. So please do come down quietly and orderly, in an orderly fashion, I should say, to the microphones. We want to hear your questions and comments. And again, please keep your comments succinct, as they say, and your questions as well, to the point. That way we can get to as many of you as possible. Come one, come all. It doesn't cost you anything, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Before we do, though, let's give these guys credit. Sir,
yes. My brief comment is basically come forth from Q-tip, Q-tip, Q-tip. I mean, that voice represents Diane McIntyre, sound and motion and sound of James Brown. I mean, that is the voice. And if you think about Q-tip, you think about someone that's so screwed, you could go to hell and convince the devil to give a glass of ice water. So my thing is that, like, what I would like to see is that, like, to really talk about the sound continuity of people like Q-tip. They also represent Chuck D and others. That voice, those voices that represent the African world continuity. It's the drum folks music. It's the gumbo people music. And in that, Q-tip represent to me what Will Burton represent to collages and John Davis to murals.
Well said. Thank you. Who was saying that? About the voice and this continuity of the voice as a tonal ideal in African American culture, the thing that we're all trying to get to, you might say.
I feel like you said it. I mean, I think that's what you said. You know, like, I mean, because I guess it's like, it's hard to, for me at least, it's hard to express what a certain voice does. It just touches you in a place, right? So, you know, I mean, I'm a huge soul music fan, right? So
and Philly's a big soul music fan.
Oh, Philly is soul all day, right? So the sound of a Layla Hathaway, or the sound of a Donny Hathaway, or there are just particular sounds that people can make that I feel, if I hear Miriam Akiba make a certain sound, I feel it. And Q-Tip fits in with that. Like, he fit in with that. So I have the same feeling. So I guess it's just about that continuity. And I feel like we haven't talked about Fife, or we haven't talked about Lady.
Yes.
But I think that...
And Fife is a compliment, not merely a compliment, but also their voice is complimentary.
He didn't hit me the same way.
Sure.
No, he didn't hit me the same way. But...
He probably hit you in a different way, though, I imagine.
I mean, I'm going to be honest. I'm going to be honest about this. The thing about it, for me, Fife was an acquired taste, right? But the reason why he was an acquired taste goes back to the fact that he was the counterpoint to Tip.
Yes.
Right? And so the thing that made a lot of people love Fife was the thing that made me, in the beginning, dislike Fife. I didn't actually understand why they needed each other until they weren't together anymore.
That's interesting. And just to refer to this again briefly, when Public Enemy was signed, a lot of people were saying, "Why do you need this flavor guy?"
Yeah.
Like that was like the number one thing that Chuck had to keep explaining. Like, no, you don't understand. Like, this is what we're going to do. And so I totally get that.
Sorry, can I just jump in? In terms of what he was saying too with the James Brown comparison, I mean, James Brown and Bobby Berg, there was that vocal connection playing off of each other. And I also actually wanted to tie it into something that you were talking about, which is the collage. Part of what James Brown was doing with his voice also was telling the band what to do. And he was essentially DJing with his voice and with his body. Dance is such an important part of that as well. He was signaling the band with different parts. You know, he was telling somebody to take a solo or somebody to stop playing and all that. And essentially, in terms of what you're
completing the melody and the rhythm of the recording as well.
Yes. And basically, he was physically with his body and his voice doing what a DJ or producer would do with the fader. You know, cut out all the instruments and let the drums go. Bring the bass back in. You know, bring the horns in. And so, to me, that's a very clear connection to a tradition of African American aesthetics.
And may in part explain the hunger, the rabid hunger many disc jockeys had for getting James Brown's music or rappers rapping over it. That spiritual connection, which they felt very clearly. Thank you. Yes, that's right. Thank you, please.
How you doing? My name is Derek. Real quick story. If you're from New York, you remember a store called The Wiz, right? You remember that store? I used to work there for a year and a half. And in 1996, I actually had the pleasure of traveling my favorite group of all time. And I was at work the day that Beats by the Lab came out. You remember we had the hologram cover and everything, right? And I remember this shit was off the shelf like hotcakes. It was gone, right? It was gone. Everybody wanted to hear the new album, after Midnight Marauders. And after a while, people got the album, they were like, it was kind of, nobody was really into it that much. And ironically, it was the first time anybody had heard of Jay Dilla, which is like, he's God now, which is, really weird. I like the album, personally. I liked it. I just want to know from everybody in the panel, just basically what do you thought about that album, and why do you think that album wasn't appreciated as much as the other work?
Good question.
I think the thing about that album, and this is something that even myself, because I showed up around in between records, Midnight Marauders and Beats Rhymes and Life, and I remember my boy had Midnight Marauders and it was a cracked CD, so after Electric Relaxation, everything skipped. So. And I was sitting there, I was like, oh man, I want to hear the rest of this album, I want to hear more from this group. So I finally saved up, and I was able to get Midnight Marauders, but that was like 2 weeks before Beats, Rhymes, and Life came out. So I was sitting down with the record, and then 2 weeks later I get Beats, Rhymes, and Life, and I'm just sitting there, it's like, there's such a difference between these two records, but I love them both. And I think one of the reasons why people didn't initially dig the record is because it's kind of hard when an artist kind of goes through those transformations in their career. They have to make that choice. I mean, you're sitting there, it's like, well, I want to do
this because I feel a certain way. But there may be people that just kind of my core fan base basically. It's like, well, what do I do? You know, do I go this way? And for them, it was just kind of like, you know, I wasn't there. I can't specifically speak for him, but in terms of Dilla's involvement, I mean, he was just, I mean, we were saying it in the Red Bull Music Academy lecture. You know, he's like, yeah, we'd be in the studio and we'd be working, you know, the UMA, and Dilla would come downstairs and we'd be working on a sample and a beat, and he'd do in 15 minutes what we'd be thinking like 3 hours, and he'd just go back upstairs and start working on some more beats and stuff. And so, you know, I think for them it was kind of like a natural thing, especially, you know, the fact they were trying to keep the ship together, because at this point Fife had moved to Atlanta. And so it's kind of like, you know, you guys that have seen the documentary, you know, their personal relationship was kind of, and Q-Tip was, you know, kind of taking on, you know, Islam. And so his beliefs were evolving. I mean, it's something that you do. You know, at that point, you know, they were entering into their mid-late 20s. Things are a little bit different than when you're 18, 19 in a school. So they took that choice, and you know, for a lot of new fans, you know, there's cutoffs. You know, some people are like, hey, you know, there's nothing better than 3 Feet High and Rising. You just can't top that. That's the best De La Soul record ever. Even in Tribe's own discography. They're like, oh, Midnight Marauders or Low End Theory. And you fight your war, and there's both sides that tug at that. And when it came to Dilla, a lot of cats were just kind of like, I don't know. But it took a few years. And some of them, you know, they loved his stuff and didn't even know it. And I think that's something that helped turn it around. So,
you know, and just before we go to the next question, there's a saying that that all art looks ugly at first.
Yeah.
So even the things that we think are, you know, I don't know, the first time they saw the Wright brothers playing, I'm sure people weren't like, oh man, it's amazing. You know, it was like, what in the world is that? So I think as well, he was really so ahead of his time, you know, that it was bound to be the kind of thing that people would like hear and say, okay, I'm not really sure about. I can remember again, please forgive the Public Enemy references, but I remember playing It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back for one of our friends, and he listened to it, the whole album, Nation of Millions, and he said, I like it, but I don't really hear anything from the street. That was his response. And I mean, that's what he said. So I think sometimes when things are new, people aren't really necessarily ready to go all the way.
Also one thing, like, I mean, I'm a Dilla fan, stan. I think he's incredible. But with Midnight Marauders and Low End Theory, I think Tribe set the bar so high that no matter what he did, they're still going to say, well, this isn't really messing with Low End Theory and Midnight Marauders.
And it's interesting you say that, because at the time Midnight Marauders was released, their third album, that's what people were saying about it relationship to Low End Theory. It's like, yeah, it's not Low End Theory, it's all right, you know. So the definition of a classic, I guess, is something that changes in this variable. Yes, please.
Good evening. My name is Raydar. I'm really enjoying the panel so far. I have a question.
So far?
So I'm sure I'll enjoy it.
Just check.
I have a question, and I was at the Robert Glasper show a couple nights ago at the Highline, and
for his new album, Black Radio.
Black Radio. And I was really struck, because a couple of nights before that I was at Jazz Arena Center, which is a very different kind of environment to hear jazz, right? And I'm thinking at the Robert Glasper show, this is a real serious jazz show, right? But in the same moment, hip hop's presence is all up and through it, and specifically you can trace that back, I think, to what Q-Tip did in his production, and not just that, but what Tribe sort of represented and what Dilla sort of represented. And I started thinking about this sort of, not just in like a theoretical way, like they may have sampled jazz records and stuff like that, but also in terms of the musicians that they brought in too. You know, Robert Glasper can talk about working with Dilla, or different musicians talk about working with Q-Tip on different productions. So, you know, one of the gripes about hip hop is that it's become too mechanical, too many machines are involved. The truth is that it's putting a lot of jazz musicians to work. So I just wondered, if, especially younger guys, I just wondered if Dr. Schloss, you want to talk about like sort of incorporating live musicians into how this production and how that works, or if you all want to talk about, you know, sort of, since you are jazz musicians and you run an ensemble and things like that, if you want to talk about sort of this new, you know, live musician in the production process, sort of.
Great question. Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, I can just briefly, you know, early on, and I think a lot of people forget this, there was a real resistance to using live musicians in hip-hop, because it was supposed to be about records. And I often, at one time, used to hear people say, if there's live musicians on it, it's not hip-hop, period.
It's R&B.
What's that?
It's R&B. That's what they were.
Yeah. And so I think it took, for me, my opinion, and anybody's free to disagree, is that it was a generational thing. I think what was necessary was for a generation of jazz musicians to be raised listening to hip-hop, so it was already part of their musical conception, so that they didn't have to think about how do we combine these two things. It was already self-evident that they could go together because they were part of that same person in that. I don't know if that is...
I just want to just say, one of the originators of this thing we call jazz, who seemed accepted and got into hip-hop way before a lot of his peers, was Max Roach, who I had the pleasure of meeting through Fab by Freddy. Max Roach was Fab's godfather, and he was a good friend with Dad. And it was amazing how early, while other people were disparaging the art form, he was talking about it being, again, a continuation of the culture.
Yeah, to be specific, Max used to, very early on, in the 80s, early 80s, he was curious. I was, DJ across the street from me in Brooklyn, and I was rhyming a little bit, and he came over very curious about what I was doing, and when he saw my DJ do his little thing, and a few rhymes I had, he basically, we were walking back to the house.
You're modest, Fab. You did change the beat.
Well, this was before Change the Beat. Before I changed the Beat. But anyway, Max said to me, and I always thought he was just trying to placate a young, like a little youth. He said, man, what you guys are doing is as incredible as what me, Bird, and Disney and us were doing. And then he talked about how with the African...
And Fab, you don't know how important it was to hear that from Max Roach when, I'll say his name, Stanley Crouch was giving me hell every day at the Village Voice.
Quite vividly. I remember calling Max right after that incident. Yeah. He explained that a lot of cats want him to keep playing the same thing. But Max told me that what he heard me and the DJ doing were, he talked about how Western music had been 3 equal parts of melody, harmony, and rhythm, and as the African influence got involved, it became more about the rhythm, and what he heard me and the DJ doing was just strictly rhythm. And that this thing was going to be humongous, and it was going to grow to become even bigger. And I just thought, oh man, that's so nice, but I just thought it was really cool. And it turned out that he was, he was quite on point with it, and was very supportive of the culture, the music, just the whole attitude, and what was being produced throughout.
Do you gentlemen want to say anything about Glasgow or what's going on in terms of jazz?
Yeah, just in general, I already said it, but just to keep it in perspective that, it's a sample, we're still sampling music that generally started with instruments and bands. But you're right, it took a generation for a lot of the hip-hop influence to catch up, and that's actually something that I'm kind of dealing with now. It's just like, if I say jazz, you might get a picture in your head. And so many of you come to me and say Kenny G, but just like in hip-hop, where everybody is in support, maybe the Nicki Minaj's and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm not a fan, whatever. But it's the same thing, that's my point. Not everybody in the jazz world gets along or agrees or listens to the same thing. So that's what's happening now with my generation, I guess specifically me, even this show. There's some of my mentors or old band leaders that, are older.
And what you're saying is that for jazz musicians of a certain age, this is not a question, actually. It's not even like a division, actually.
No, it does break down the age, but there are Max Roaches. I knew about Max Roach, and maybe 2 months ago you heard Sonny Rollins say hip hop and jazz is the same. Sonny Rollins, he's like the last one.
Miles Davis felt that way as well.
Yeah, and really we make all these boxes. I'm not trying to be all artisty right now, but we make all these boxes, but it's really all the same. It came from the Black American culture. And this Black American music, if you're talking about rhythm and blues, R&B, rock and roll, jazz, blues, everything that's kind of very popular today is really the same thing. And it depends on what a Q-tip does with it. It depends on what we do with it. It depends on the person and how you approach it. And it's not that in the 80s, if a hip-hop group had a band, they probably were playing some R&B music. He probably hired Whitney Houston's band or Luther's band and got him up in there, and that's what I'm talking about. It's a different thing today. The music has a certain attitude and a certain swagger, just like you wouldn't really ask James Brown to rap. He's an integral part of hip-hop, but you wouldn't really, you wouldn't put him in the today's hip-hop context. You let James Brown be James Brown. You know what I'm saying? So it's 2 different things. You can say it's generational, but nowadays it's a whole approach to it, and actually give it the time of day. You have your Robert Glaspers, who's really kind of putting it out there. They put a very big focus on J Dilla. So that's why many of you might fall in love, and a lot of these things are becoming standards for a lot of live musicians and things like that. Our stakes is high, it's always played. So like there's many J Dilla songs, and then I'm actually from California, so even the culture here in New York, or if you talk to Mars, whatever, it wasn't cool to be playing instruments or whatever. All my boys, they were doing their thing, whether it was sports, or some of them were banging, or whatever it is. It wasn't a band. So part of the thing that I connected with my regular everyday friends was through a tribe called Quest. It was through Guru, Jazz and Taz. It's like, oh yeah, you like jazz, your dad listens to jazz. Have you heard of Jazz and Taz? Have you heard of electric relaxation? Have you heard of such and such? So it's a lot of that try and make it comfortable for somebody to not have to fit into your, whether you're talking early 90s MC Hammer, or in Cali you're talking mid 90s The Chronic. Trust me, like I didn't even know about, I knew about Tribe, but I didn't really know Tribe until well after the West Coast.
You got through that.
Yeah, I didn't really play into it.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, my name is Kevin, and I'm strictly from Brooklyn myself, and I'm one of the DJs that came out there and put my equipment up to the light poles. Crab know how it was, DJ different parts. My question is for Raydar. I'm a musician myself, you know what I'm saying? I don't know how to read music, but I can play an instrument, I can, you know what I'm saying? Once I hear the beat 3 seconds, I'm on it. I can play it. I want to know how can I get into that room and be one of the musicians that's in there.
What, at Berkeley?
Yeah.
Shoot, man, it's just in Boston and stuff. Just come through. Like it's you enroll, you audition. The enrollment process is online, or you can fill it out, and they have this audition process that you got to get some recommendation letters and stuff, and at least that's how it was when I got there. And you perform, and whatever kind of thing it is, because there's a turntable program too, like I said, so it's expanding, it's growing.
I play keyboard, drums, bass.
Oh, word. So yeah, I mean, you could land there. You audition on whatever your principal instrument would be. There's students who play a bunch of instruments, but you just pick the main one that you want to kind of focus on for your private lessons. And yeah, they just set you up with the ensemble audition ratings, and you can take classes and all that. Yeah.
Can I say something? Yeah. Just do it, man. Yeah. You don't need no auditions. No.
We went to doing it for a hobby, like I've been DJing for K Solo.
Yeah, you don't take no long time for a hobby.
It was my MC.
Yeah, just seriously, like jazz didn't start in the school, hip hop definitely didn't start there. None of that music really started this. My recommendation is just do it. And you go holler at me. I have a lot of outlets.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Good evening, panel. My name is Matthew. I'm a Brooklyn-based music journalist. The young lady that was after me actually asked the question I was going to ask in reference to Robert Glasper, how jazz music and hip-hop is sort of intertwining. I've been working on some written pieces for that. So